Welcome back. This is the 72nd segment of Making Sense for 7 minutes, and it is the second of 25 segments where we are going to be taking a hard look at evil and suffering. Now, there are two arenas of investigation and exploration that need to be undertaken. But there's a difference between the two, and yet they relate to each other. One of the areas where you and I really need to explore the issue of evil and suffering is the philosophical area and the philosophical questions. The second is the personal area that has to do with how we respond when we are in the midst of the pain that comes on from either evil and the suffering that it brings, or just suffering that takes place in the natural course of life. So one is a required objectivity where we kind of back up, and the other is where we're in a place where we can't back up and we have to bring some of our thoughtful capital with us. And that hints at what the relationship between these two happens to be. And the fact of the matter is, you can choose, if you so desire, not to think deeply and extensively about the questions of evil and suffering. But there's no way that you're going to be able to avoid being involved with evil and suffering. And how you deal with the time that this involvement takes place is going to be determined by a large extent as to how you have thought about these issues before the crisis comes along. Boy, I hope that makes sense, because if we don't think clearly before the crisis, we're not going to know what to think during the crisis. So, dare I say that we need to not only look at the sources and the causes of suffering and evil, but also the purpose of suffering and evil. Now, as we enter into our exploration, let's start with the question of evil first. And a working definition is that evil is that which is morally bad or wrong. It's depravity. It's sin. And it always has a moral component to it. Its perpetuation is due to the immorality of others or ourselves. Eleanor Stump is a lady who has done a great deal of research and writing on the issue of evil. And in her essay, which I highly recommend, The Mirror of Evil, she makes a distinction between that which she refers to as ordinary wrongdoing, such as running a red light, and real wickedness. And the history of humanity has been awash with real wickedness. Another recommendation that I'll make to you is this book by Will and Ariel Durant. It's called The Lessons of History. Can you see it? Okay, good. And in it, they make this point. You ready? In the last now this was written in 1968, and they say in the last 3,421 years of recorded history, there's only been 268 that have seen no war. And if you look at the 20th century, It is like the bloodiest and the most evil, uh, deadliest century, maybe in the history of mankind. Alexander Solzhenitsyn referred to it as the caveman century. Look at these statistics. Germany killing Jews during World War II, 6 million. Turks killing Armenians in 1914 and 1915, 1.5 million. Stalin killing people in Russia during his communist regime in the 30s and 40s, 30 million. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party in China. In 1949 to 1976, 65 million of his citizens were murdered. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. 1/4 of the population of Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. 2 million people killed. Saddam Hussein's troops killing Iraqi Kurds, 1987 to 1988. 100,000. Serbs killing Bosnian Muslims from 1992 to 1995, 200,000. Houthis killing Tutsis in 1 year in 1994, 800,000. This is the 20th century, where Os Guinness, or about which Os Guinness says in another book that I highly recommend called Unspeakable, in the 20th century, according to a report from the International Association of Genocide Scholars, genocides have killed more people than all wars. And wars have taken more than 100 million lives. But of course, as Guinness points out in his book, humanly perpetrated evil covers the little and local powers of abuse too. It included not only the tortured and the slain who were massacred by the millions, but also the neglected child, the abused teenager, the battered wife, the cheated employee, and the robbed pensioner. And then there's the philosophical question of why, and the theological question of God, why? And we have a lot to explore. Thanks, y'all.